The video game industry has gone through many trends and developments regarding both creativity within the games we play and the technology on which we play them. One of the most significant periods of immense change was going from the end of the fourth generation of consoles in the early 90s with the Sega Genesis, Super NES, and Neo Geo, through the fifth generation with the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Nintendo 64, and into the start of the sixth generation with the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and Dreamcast. In that 8-year-long span, the video games we knew and loved evolved in mind-blowing ways and at breakneck speeds. For any of you younger viewers who are too little to remember or possibly not even born yet to witness these changes, it's hard to describe how the mundane things we take for granted now were truly innovative back when they first showed up. For example, Metal Gear Solid being completely voice acted from beginning to end in 1998 was a big fucking deal. And then you have the drastic increase in graphical capabilities. One example I always go to is Final Fantasy. The difference between Final Fantasy VI, a 16-bit game on the SNES, and Final Fantasy X is only 6 years. Another noteworthy example is Silent Hill on the PS1 and Silent Hill 3 on the PS2. A difference of only 4 years, with the latter pushing the console to its absolute limits only 3 years after its launch, with character models that look better and more detailed than even some early PS3-era games. And this can go on and on and on, because the rate at which the power of our consoles grew in this time period seemed miraculous, bordering on impossible, to the point where it completely warped our expectations on what a generational leap truly was, because a lot of us didn't internalize that gaming was still a young medium, and was thus maturing faster. It was a truly prosperous era that showered us with incredible new technology and an endless stream of remarkable games to play that constantly pushed boundaries and pioneered new subgenres. Being a lover of video games from the early 90s to mid-2000s was nothing short of pure bliss. I even made a video dedicated specifically to the year 1998 and how amazing it was, and I'm considering covering a couple other years within this time frame. And then, late 2005 came along. With the release of the Xbox 360, the industry was thrust into a new high-definition world, with the additional expectation that everyone was getting high-speed internet and wanted to play games that used it. And on top of that, there was a wildly unpredictable mix of games being made. Experimentation was heavy during this era, yet so was the presence of shovelware, bad habits, and increasing budgets. The seventh generation of console gaming, primarily the period from 2005 to 2013, was a time of rampant low quality and both bold and ill-advised ideas where publishers and developers threw many things at the wall to see what stuck. And this resulted in a few instant classics, a lot of trends that came and went, and some, or much really, unrepentant trash. To make things a bit more gloomy, this was also a period where indie development was nowhere near as accessible as it is now, especially in those first few years. So the occasional AA oddity and niche gem were all that we had if we wanted to take a break from the usual blockbusters. Having survived that time frame myself and looking back on it now, I'm actually a little bit surprised I managed to escape it with my love of video games still intact. If you were the type of person who only played Halo or Call of Duty or a couple of sports games at the time and were content with just that, then you probably didn't notice the majority of these issues. But if someone told me that they quit video games or considered quitting during this era because they no longer found any fulfillment in the games coming out at the time, I wouldn't really blame them. This was a time that really beat cynicism into people, and for understandable reasons. Some of you, particularly younger viewers or those who only stuck to Halo and Call of Duty, as I mentioned before, might be wondering, well, what games are you talking about specifically? And it's not really limited to one pool of games with a single descriptor. The problem with this era was a multitude of categories, each with their own fair share of notable perpetrators. Let's start off with bad action games. For some strange reason, this generation was loaded with mediocre to unbearably awful first and especially third-person shooters, and this trend was almost certainly kicked off by the raving success of Gears of War, Uncharted, and Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, which all released near the start of this era, and a lot of these painfully subpar games were published or even developed by fairly big names. In the best case, they would be decent enough to cultivate a small following of fans who look back on the game with fond nostalgia. But generally, these pieces of trash were left behind to rot in the unforgiving sands of irrelevancy the moment they released. A fairly early example would be Haze, developed by Free Radical Design, creators of the fantastic Time Splitters series and published by Ubisoft. Sony tried to hype it up as their big new first-person exclusive, but it all came crashing down the day it launched and people were smacked in the face by a terrible story, horrific graphical performance, shallow gameplay, and an annoyingly short single-player campaign. It was a shabby experience visually and interactively, and the game's abysmal failure caused Free Radical to go bankrupt. Thankfully, they have since been reformed and are working on an unannounced Time Splitters title, so maybe they'll get a chance to reintroduce themselves to the world with a properly good game. As time went on, more and more action games of questionable quality continued to come out. In 2010, Koei Tecmo released Quantum Theory, the most shamefully obvious Gears of War ripoff that has probably ever been developed, at least by a company with some name recognition. Seriously, look at this thing. If I showed a screenshot of this game or even a couple minutes of isolated combat to someone who didn't know it existed, they might have thought it was a Gears spin-off. As you may expect, this title was an abject failure. It was mechanically okay, but just wasn't anywhere close to the quality of the series it was so clearly inspired by. Then in 2011, we were graced by Brink, developed by Splash Damage and published by Bethesda. It was supposed to be a huge deal, an awesome first-person shooter with eye-catching aesthetics and badass acrobatic movement. But its interesting ideas couldn't overcome its tangled web of bugs and poor performance, and general lack of gameplay variety to capitalize on those potentially cool concepts it had. And let's not forget the infamous Duke Nukem Forever, a game that took 12 years to come out only to still be a buggy and forgettable mess of an experience. Worst part is, the recent leak of the 2001 build of the game actually showed that it was shaping up to be a solid title at the time. And it doesn't stop there. This era was filled with other half-baked or downright shitty action games. Body Count from Codemasters, Eat Lead: The Return of Mad Hazard, which was a parody of action game cliches, but still fell flat on its face when it came to just being a fun game on its own. Never Dead, developed by Rebellion and published by Konami. Damnation, also published by Codemasters. Mind Jack by the now defunct Feel Plus and published by Square Enix. And don't forget the horrific action-focused era of the Resident Evil franchise. It didn't start off too badly, with 5 still being fun despite clearly being the point where scares were officially tossed out the window. Then we got Resident Evil 6, which still isn't too terrible, but still considered a step down from 5 for a lot of fans. But we also got Operation Raccoon City, which was just a by-the-books co-op squad shooter that isn't even canon. It had absolutely nothing going for it to justify its existence. The shittiness of action-era Resident Evil even went beyond our designated time frame with the release of Umbrella Corps in 2016, which was somehow even worse. And Famitsu, the popular Japanese magazine, awarded that game the same score they gave Resident Evil 7 a year later, in case you needed a reason to throw Famitsu reviews into the trash. This period in gaming was also home to a lot of bad licensed action games based on movie properties. You could at least make an argument that the Terminator Salvation movie was still fairly entertaining in its own right, and I would believe that you truly felt that way. But if you told me you thought the Terminator Salvation game was fun, I would ask if someone was holding your family hostage and forcing you to spread lies. There was also a shitty Punisher game, a shitty Expendables game, a shitty G.I. Joe game based on the live-action movies, a shitty Kick-Ass game, and a shitty Rambo game. Shit everywhere. Every publisher and their mother was trying to make some half-assed action game. It was bizarre. Thankfully, we still ended up with gems like Vanquish, Bayonetta, Infamous, and others. But god damn, there was just so much trash to sift through as well. And to add insult to injury, some of those had potential. Between the cheap dung made for a pocket-lint budget and popular new IPs that managed to shine amongst that dung, there were also some action games that managed to scrape by as pretty decent games with cult followings, like Capcom's Lost Planet and Dark Sector by Digital Extremes, which would be the origin point of Warframe. The main character's name is literally Hayden Tenno. To add on to this, there was also a gargantuan influx of Grand Theft Auto clones, a topic that's honestly worthy of its own video, and I'm sure someone else has already made it. This category is loaded with games of varying quality. Some were painfully mundane, like Driver 3, while others were kinda decent, like Just Cause and Total Overdose. And contrary to what I said earlier about them, some of those decent ones were actually also licensed games based on movies, believe it or not. Namely, Scarface, The World Is Yours, and The Godfather, which even had Marlon Brando reprising his role as Vito Corleone, even though he was basically seconds from death every time he was in the recording booth. And a couple other clones actually ended up being fantastic, like Saints Row 2 and Sleeping Dogs. The fact that we never got Sleeping Dogs 2 is one of the biggest mistakes in the history of this industry, and being reminded of it fills me with a quiet anger. The 7th gen was also a big era for control and mechanical gimmicks, specifically motion controls and quick-time events in action games. Nintendo led this fleet with the Wii, placing the Wiimote and nunchuck attachment at the front and center of the console's marketing campaign, as well as a laser focus on Wii Sports, the party game that was smartly bundled with every console unit that allowed players and their families to immediately become immersed with the motion control concept. Of course, while the Wii's motion controls were functional and reliable, it didn't really stop people from criticizing its importance for games that could clearly work well without it. While it was fun to play party games centered around the gimmick for brief sessions, it ultimately never reinvented the wheel or established itself as a form of control that the whole industry would shift towards. At the end of the day, a lot of people were still perfectly happy with just sitting and playing a game the normal way. Prefer it even. And with the Nintendo Wii focusing so intently on motion controls to the point where it was a core selling point for the console, Sony decided to follow suit with the 6-axis, the debut PS3 controller which also had a selling point of motion controls. Sony is no stranger to motion controls at this point, considering the existence of the iToy for the PS2, but the PS3 itself wasn't so committed to the gimmick as the Wii was, so a lot of games either had superficial support for it or ignored it entirely. But there were some rare occasions where games built around the motion functions of 6-axis were actually made worse as a result. The biggest example was Lair, an exclusive for the PS3 and probably the first big game to center its gameplay around the controller's motion capabilities. It looked like a cool game at first, a fantasy action title where you rode dragons and set fire to armies and castles in big maps and sprawling battles. But when you actually got your hands on the controller and started to move around, it felt a lot clumsier and unintuitive than you would expect for a game that was supposedly made with motion controls in mind. Reviewers praised almost everything else about the game: visuals, setting, soundtrack, sound quality, storytelling. But once you actually played it, it all fell apart. Eventually, Factor 5 released a patch that allowed you to play the game with normal controls, and it was a massive improvement, but it was too little, too late. The game had already gained a reputation for being a massive disappointment, and the patch just couldn't save it. The studio closed in 2009, and Lair was their last game. And then there was the Kinect from Microsoft, a peripheral that added motion control capabilities to your Xbox 360, 5 years after it launched, and at a price that was only $50 short of one of the available SKUs for the console itself. It was a hard sell, but the idea of full-body motion control was an interesting enough idea that caught enough people's attention that Microsoft decided to further commit to the product by launching it alongside the Xbox One. It had improved functionality and even facial recognition login, but still, it came with shortcomings, like voice commands being unable to understand thick accents. As always, some people still liked the idea of the motion-controlled gimmick, but ultimately, it proved to be just that, a gimmick. And the device would steadily get phased out and grow underused until it was forgotten about entirely by Microsoft themselves, soon getting discontinued in 2017. It all just goes to show that while motion controls can be fun for short bursts every once in a while, they'll never be a replacement for good old controllers. It simply wasn't worth making some huge AAA game that revolved around the gimmick, because those weren't the type of games people wanted to play with motion controls, and this bottlenecked any widespread appeal the format would have. Today, we still do have controllers and peripherals with motion control capabilities, but they're either not the core focus, or they're simply a necessary addition to a greater experience, such as virtual reality, which is proving to be a much more viable way of allowing games to offer a greater sense of interactivity than simply shaking a stick at your TV. QuickTime events were another bothersome feature of many games during this time. QTEs weren't a new idea necessarily. They were already a big part of early interactive story games like Dragon's Lair. But the current iteration of QTEs that we know today eventually gained a poor reputation and harsh reactions due to eventually becoming intrusive and totally unnecessary to the experience of many games they were included in. And we probably have the success of Resident Evil 4 and the original God of War to thank for it, even though they were a couple of the few games to implement the mechanic fairly tastefully, and even then, that's still arguable. A lot of action games were guilty of half-baked QTE implementation, placing them in spots that were either totally inconsistent or completely unexpected, making them almost impossible to get on the first try, or making them extremely difficult to time. Or in some cases, not even totally clear as to what buttons you were supposed to hit in what sequence, or what direction you had to push the analog sticks, or whatever. Uncharted, Tomb Raider, Resident Evil 5 and 6, later God of War games, and even personal favorites of mine like Bayonetta, all perpetrators of stupid or annoying QTEs that added nothing substantial or even the slightest bit of more immersion to the experience. More often than not, they were just jarring interruptions that gave you a sudden game over screen outside of the normal gameplay loop, which you might have been dominating mere seconds before. They have their place in narrative-focused games that are basically modern-day point-and-clicks, like games made by Telltale or Quantic Dream, but in regular action games that already have a normal, sometimes fast gameplay loop, no thank you. Now let's dive deeper into the dregs of this generation by breaking down some of the horrifics on a console-by-console basis, because all three of the major players, the PlayStation 3, Wii, and Xbox 360, all had big issues of their own. Since we're already on the topic of awful games, let's actually begin with the Wii. Now you might think, hold on a second, the Wii has a big selection of great exclusives. What's wrong with it? Well, I'm not talking about its exclusives. I'm talking about the absolutely obscene amount of Z-list, no-budget shovelware that completely infests the console's library due to its popularity. The Wii was a behemoth of a success, yes, and its first-party titles were, by and large, solid, but god damn, was that console also just a fucking landfill of low-effort shit by no-name developers trying to capitalize on the little machine by duping clueless parents and grandparents into buying anything that looked like it would keep their kids busy for just a single afternoon. A console with huge sales plus low development costs equals a plague of trash. Admittedly, past consoles also had their fair share of shovelware back in the day, and a lot of Wii shovelware also ended up on the PS2 near the end of its life. But it thankfully established a great legacy before that, and again, a lot of this shit is licensed. M&M's Kart Racing, Action Girls Racing, Anubis 2, Ninja Bread Man, Billy the Wizard Rocket Broomstick Racing, Alvin and the Chipmunks, The Smurfs Dance Party, Iron Chef America, Chicken Shoot, Balls of Fury. Yes, a video game based on the 2007 comedy featuring Christopher Walken as a character named Feng and dressed in a Chinese outfit. The list goes on and on and on. I could be here all day firing off names, and even throw in some fake ones and you would never be able to tell. The shovelware pit is almost bottomless, and I'm sure that many children have had less than stellar birthdays and Christmases because of oblivious parents getting one of these turds for them. Next is the PlayStation 3. If you're around my age and were already active on the internet around the time the PS3 launched, then you already know its biggest issues. The price, the abysmal first 2 years where it had an aggravatingly small amount of worthwhile exclusives, and the cell processor making third-party developers sweat. Now, the context for the price was at least understandable. It came with the fancy new technology that was a Blu-ray drive, and the PS3 was actually the cheapest Blu-ray player on the market at the time. Throw on the fact that it also played video games, and it was a no-brainer to buy if you wanted to enter the world of high definition. So even though you had to spend a particularly pretty penny, it at least had good reason to be that costly. But the other two issues can't really explain those away. For nearly the entire first 2 years of the console's existence, the only first and second party exclusives that were available to keep fans busy were Resistance Fall of Man, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, Ratchet & Clank Future Tools of Destruction, Motorstorm, Warhawk, and Lair. That's it. That was the entire first or second party lineup from launch in November 2006 to September 2008. The only third-party exclusives that were around in this time frame to help were Metal Gear Solid 4, Ridge Racer 7, Folklore, and Heavenly Sword. It wasn't until the next month, October 2008, where the Steam finally picked up a bit with Little Big Planet, Resistance 2, SOCOM US Navy SEALs Confrontation, Motorstorm Pacific Rift, and finally Killzone 2 a few months after. From then on, the ball started to roll and the PS3 soon gained a library worth checking out. However, regardless of how many exclusives it slowly managed to gather, the biggest problem persisted: the dreaded cell processor, bane of many developers' production pipeline. It was often touted by Sony executives and marketing as a very powerful component of the PS3's hardware. And while that might have been true, this doesn't mean it was easy to work with. Many third-party devs had a nightmare of a time getting the PS3 versions of their games to perform as well as the Xbox 360 versions, and this led to the PS3 being the worst investment of the two if you planned on getting a console for third-party games. For me, the biggest example I can give is Bayonetta. The PS3 version of that fantastic game was just plain abysmal. As a character action game, it should have performed at or close to 60 frames per second pretty much the entire way through. But on the PS3, it never came close to reaching that number, sometimes dipping below 30 when shit gets really hectic. If your first experience with Bayonetta was on the PS3, I genuinely feel sorry for you, and I hope you are able to give the game a second chance on literally any of the other platforms it released on. This leads me to the third and final console of that era, the Xbox 360. First, Microsoft was really fucking lucky that the PS3 developed a reputation for terrible performance for third-party games, because that made the 360 more desirable, which probably saved this console from almost being a failure, because it sure as shit didn't have as many exclusives to speak of in the long run. This period is where the Xbox brand became tied, often negatively, to having only 3 first-party IPs worth talking about that lasted through the whole generation: Halo, Gears of War, and Forza. It had other franchises like Fable and Crackdown, as well as some fairly popular third-party exclusives too, even in Japan, shockingly enough. But those first 3 IPs were the top dogs of the Xbox lineup, And if you weren't interested in any of them, then the 360 probably became a reluctant purchase to avoid potential poor performance of PS3 versions of multi-platform games. And honestly, that's what the console ended up being for me. I heard nightmarish things about Bayonetta's PS3 performance back in the day, so I bought it on the 360. And since then, it was my default machine of choice for multi-platform titles. But unfortunately for a lot of people, avoiding the PS3 still didn't save them from performance troubles. It wasn't the games malfunctioning, however, it was the console itself. The dreaded red ring of death was a plague on many Xbox 360 owners who encountered it, and a constant fear for those who didn't. For those who might be too young to recall, I'll elaborate. The front of the Xbox 360 has a green power symbol surrounded by 4 lights making a circle, and when the console is operating normally, those 4 lights are green. But when something is wrong, they're red, and the cause of the issue is known in different ways. The most worrying of them all, though, was the top left, and bottom right lights being red, signifying a hardware failure. This was the pattern that meant your console was fucked, and it was shockingly widespread, ranging anywhere from 23.7% of units affected to 54.2% in 2009. Other common hardware problems for the console were scratched discs and bricking caused by firmware updates. The 360's technical woes were so severe and common, Microsoft experienced a smorgasbord of investigations and class action lawsuits. So good job on getting a 360 for Halo and better performing third-party games. Now you have to dodge the frag grenade of potential hardware malfunctions that may lead to buying a new one. Yet another terrible thing about this era was the mindset that certain publishers had regarding the implementation of high-speed internet that more and more people were gaining access to. When the 7th generation began, internet was well on its way to becoming a widespread utility as opposed to a luxury, and game companies saw the writing on the wall, but some interpreted that writing in very questionable ways. The most obvious to people is going to be the persistent and ongoing DLC problem. What started off as horse armor for the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion became something much more predatory. Even before the widespread implementation of things like loot boxes and premium currency purchases, the 7th generation saw some ethical concerns of its own regarding how some publishers went about offering downloadable content. Soon it became season passes, available at or even before a game's launch, where consumers bought access to future DLC that was not even revealed to the public, making the purchase basically a content mystery box for said game. This was an issue because players didn't have any chance at previewing this content before truly committing to the purchase, making it quite a gamble. Furthermore, in 2007, Microsoft came under fire for allegations that they forced publishers to put a price on DLC that the publishers themselves wanted to release for free, because Microsoft harbored a spending spree mindset where they wanted players to constantly be browsing the Xbox Live Marketplace and buying up stuff at full price. Eventually, there also arose cases where a game's post-launch DLC was already on the disc or in the initial game files, and purchasing the DLC on digital storefronts merely offered a key to unlock the content. This exploded into an argument about whether or not a consumer is entitled to all content on the disc they bought, especially when it's functional and waiting to simply be accessed. And finally, the worst of it all, DLC being cut content that was originally intended to be part of the base game. Admittedly, over the years, many reactionary people online have thrown fits about this for certain games when it was never actually the case. Basically, any game that got DLC within the first 3 months got accused of being cut content. However, there were occasions where the outrage was accurate. Back in 2009, a couple of disgruntled former Crystal Dynamics employees stated that about 40% of Tomb Raider Underworld's DLC was cut from the original game to be sold as DLC later. Unfortunately, predatory monetization of video games is the one thing from this era that has remained not only consistent to today, but grew even more pervasive. Why? Well, because people can't help themselves. They bought the horse armor, they bought the season passes, they bought the cut content. It made the greedier publishers realize just how willing the average consumer was to part with their money in return for little to no information, utility, or transparency on what they were actually buying. And now, these monetization models are firmly cemented into the current day video game industry, and more or less considered pretty standard stuff despite the uproar they would have received only 10 years ago. The second and less problematic but still kind of annoying issue in relation to increased connectivity of this era was tacked-on multiplayer modes for games that honestly didn't need it. Tomb Raider 2013, BioShock 2, Spec Ops The Line, Dead Space 2, Condemned to Bloodshot, for Christ's sake. A frustrating thing that publishers did during this time was misinterpret the increasing spread of high-speed internet access as a prophecy that deemed single-player experiences as something that consumers were beginning to turn away, and that multiplayer modes were a future we would never come back from. The immense popularity of Call of Duty's online multiplayer didn't help either. Thus, a lot of games that were made with the intention of focusing on a single-player campaign would still end up having a haphazardly created player versus player aspect under the premise that even if a person wasn't interested in the single player, they could still be hooked by the multiplayer instead. It was a ridiculous, fallacious train of thought that some companies held at the time. Luckily, not all of those multiplayer modes were bad. Some actually ended up being okay or even great, like The Last of Us, God of War Ascension, and Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Overall, it wasn't a completely tone-deaf idea to offer more content, but in some cases, it was painfully clear when multiplayer offerings were made solely to check off a box. Things have obviously turned around since then, and now shoehorned multiplayer is no longer that much of a problem. We've thankfully gone back to remembering that carefully crafted single-player experiences are very much worthwhile investments, both as a developer and as a player. And in such cases, it's totally okay to just forego multiplayer modes entirely. The next major aspect of this era that proved to be extremely bothersome and contributed to some people abandoning gaming altogether was great game publishers who were beloved and respected during the previous generation completely losing sight of who they are, what their goals were, and what their fan bases liked. The ones that stuck out to me the most, personally, were Capcom and Square Enix. Those two companies had an abysmal 7th gen, and were consistently lambasted for blunder after blunder. With Capcom, it wasn't enough that Resident Evil was blatantly tossing aside horror. They also released Devil May Cry 4 in an unfinished state that required the second half of the game to be almost entirely backtracking through the first half. Its excellent combat was able to save the overall experience of the game, but it was still considered a pretty significant step down from 3. Then they followed it up by outsourcing the series entirely to Ninja Theory, who gave us a reboot that was even more divisive, if not straight up reviled. Same thing for Bionic Commando. More details on those two games later. Furthermore, Capcom mishandled a ton of their iconic fighting game franchises. Street Fighter continued to be their only success, while Darkstalkers went on to get buried because they released remastered games in order to test the demand for a new game despite putting no effort into marketing it, basically dooming the test to fail and stopping Darkstalkers fans from getting the new game that was promised to them. After that, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 was totally disrespected. With the ultimate version of the game out within 1 year after the base game, Capcom orphaned the title in order to put all their focus on pushing Street Fighter Cross Tekken, which ended up being a far inferior game anyway, and was a primary perpetrator in the aforementioned on-disc DLC debacle. It took some major updates to make the game decent, but by the time those changes were applied, it was too late. The game lost a ton of steam. The only active legacy IPs Capcom didn't treat like total shit during this time were just Monster Hunter, and Mega Man. Then we have Square Enix, a particularly annoying one for me because I'm such a gigantic Final Fantasy fan, and this era was fucking unbearable. The PlayStation 3 tech demo featuring a remade opening of Final Fantasy VII planted the seed of demand that would go unrealized for an additional 10 years, no matter how loudly the fans clamored for it to be real. Instead, Square would go on to give us Final Fantasy XIII, which I personally don't dislike all that much, as I do enjoy the combat, but it was extremely divisive for its characters and especially its world design, heavily criticized for being hyperlinear to the point of being roasted by fans and non-fans alike as Final Hallway 13. Then they doubled down on this game by giving it 2 more sequels, with the last one focusing solely on the character Lightning, drawing a ton of backlash for the 13 trilogy basically just being Motomu Toriyama's personal waifu series. And while 13 was causing arguments all over the internet, Square was also screwing over Swedish developer Grin, because they too were outsourcing their famous IP to them for a Final Fantasy spin-off set in 12's world of Evilus. But after several months of development and being thrown ridiculous milestones to achieve by Square, who wasn't even offering financial assistance, the game was cancelled. And then their biggest blunder of all happened, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. A traumatizing failure that you might have heard about even if you don't play Final Fantasy games. Once this MMO released and bombed Square's finances into a nuclear winter, it was all hands on deck for the publisher. They redirected as many resources as they reasonably could into salvaging it, and after 2 years, they thankfully succeeded. It was a close call if there ever was one. Oh, and this entire time was spent waiting for Final Fantasy Versus 13, which was announced in 2006 and supposed to be set within 13's universe before it was restructured into 15. Between this and Kingdom Hearts 3, Square gained a reputation of taking 10 years to release a game, a reputation that they still somewhat have even though their big restructuring in 2013 has helped quell it quite a bit. And speaking of Kingdom Hearts, while this was happening, the franchise was developing its reputation for being an inane mess of a story, and whether or not you actually agree with that, the fact that all the important canon games were being spread across a ton of different platforms only made the franchise's accessibility needlessly complicated. Thank God the HD remasters came out to smooth things up a bit and allow people to play all the games on one console. Square also bought the Tomb Raider, Hitman, Deus Ex, Thief, and Legacy of Kain IPs from Eidos. And while the Tomb Raider reboot would go on to get critical acclaim, Square considered it a financial failure because another thing they and Capcom were guilty of during this time was ridiculously unrealistic sales goals. The same would happen to Hitman Absolution, and they never even touched Legacy of Kain the entire time they owned it. The only Eidos IP that got any respect was Deus Ex with Human Revolution, one of the few glimmers of light in Square's horrendous 7th generation term. In regard to Western publishers, I could go on about Activision letting Tony Hawk, Spyro, and Crash Bandicoot fade away and only focus on Call of Duty and Blizzard IPs once they merged, but that's probably enough content for its own video. Plus, I personally didn't care much for Activision games in this time anyway. Same goes for EA, but in their case, I actually did make a video about them. An hour-and-a-half long one, in fact, about their history of acquisitions and closures. So if you're really interested in hearing 90 minutes worth of how shitty EA is, then go watch that video instead. A link will be in the description. The 7th generation was also the setting for the meteoric rise and catastrophic fall of the gritty aesthetic. With the beginning of the high-definition era, AAA games had the money and resources to truly approach the cinematics and storytelling in their games like they would movies. And with this came movie-like art direction, particularly a fascination with dirty, down-to-earth digital color grading. This was motivated by a clear desire for games to look more real or mature, but in hindsight, it really just made them look boring and bland, or at worst, offensively ugly. A fuck ton of third-person shooters had strange aesthetics that featured desaturated color palettes, making the environment very gray, or color filters that focused on one specific shade, usually brown or yellow, hence the derogatory term of piss filter used to describe some games that had a real nice piss yellow sheen over everything. Even the aforementioned Deus Ex Human Revolution was guilty of this, fantastic of a game as it is. During this time, realism was brown, war was gray, and the future was piss. And foreign countries were either green or also piss. That's just how it was, and it got really tired really quickly. Thank goodness for games like Mirror's Edge and Super Mario Galaxy helping to break that monotony. Oh, and don't forget the annoying prevalence of bloom, the blinding lighting effect that everyone figured out how to implement and thus insisting on putting it in almost every AAA game and cranking it up to 11, almost melting our fucking eyes out of our sockets when the camera was pointed at a light source, combined with a hideous amount of Gaussian blur. In the worst cases, characters' skin would glow like a goddamn lamp as if it were emitting light on its own. Elder Scrolls had it, Twilight Princess had it, Syndicate had it, and much, much more. It was a very strange obsession that some games abused the shit out of, and another aesthetic trend that made this whole era disgusting to look at. But grittiness didn't just stop at art direction, it continued into becoming the core essence of some games in their entirety, and by and large, those games were reboots of their own franchises. Yes, the gritty reboot period within the 7th generation that was loaded with odd or downright baffling creative decisions, taking formerly lighthearted and colorful IPs and making them dark and brooding, because, as we established, that was the big trend at the time. This was especially popular among Japanese companies looking to gain more popularity in the West. Some notable examples include Capcom's Bionic Commando, once a noteworthy side-scroller turned into a by-the-books action-adventure game. This attempt at a gritty reboot was particularly funny because it released more or less in tandem with Bionic Commando Rearmed, which is a true and faithful reboot of the old-school Bionic Commando experience, and received significantly more praise than its larger-budget, dark and serious counterpart. Prior to that, there was Final Fight Streetwise, another Capcom property that tried to be mature and edgy to very little success. This game was so laser-focused on attracting a Western audience, it remains the only Final Fight title to not even be released in Japan. And quite possibly the most baffling of them all, Bomberman Act Zero. Yes, a gritty reboot of Bomberman, but it didn't even adopt any sort of crazy third-person shooter combat. It maintained the usual Bomberman action puzzle gameplay. It was a total disaster both as an idea and in its execution, and is basically a blemish on the Bomberman name. Finally, we have the most notorious, widely publicized, and divisive reboot of a Japanese franchise of that entire era. Another Capcom property, showing their annoying desperation for that sweet American cash. Ninja Theory's DMC Devil May Cry. This one was a doozy. In an incredible display of tone deafness, Ninja Theory proudly showcased how little they understood the appeal of the original games, bastardizing the characterization of Dante and Virgil, turning them into cardboard cutouts that exemplified what a dumb 13-year-old thought was edgy and cool. They lacked any real personality, so Ninja Theory made up for it by just making them swear more and act like frat boys. In a conference, they called the original Dante a gay cowboy, as if anything is wrong with that to begin with, and said their new edgy Dante was like Tyler Durden, Andrew from Chronicle. Christ, even their inspirations for cool characters were totally misplaced. And you know what the damnedest thing is? Eventually, the game was remastered with a definitive edition that gave substantial tweaks to the gameplay that actually made it really good. It played much closer to the Devil May Cry that longtime fans knew and loved, but the damage to their beloved characters and their backstories was done. The game didn't sell anywhere nearly as well as Capcom hoped, and thus, the wait began for a proper DMC game, which we eventually finally received with DMC5, and it was stellar. And beyond that, there were other games you may or may not deem reboots, but were definitely aiming to be grittier than their predecessors, like Shadow the Hedgehog and Prince of Persia: Warrior Within, which actually slightly predates this video's time frame, but I'm going to mention it anyway. And speaking of Ninja Theory's DMC Devil May Cry, I'm going to give a little bit of a bonus chapter here by touching on the extremely weird and almost outright xenophobic sentiment that some Western developers openly had toward Japanese games. When Ninja Theory's take on the franchise released, there was an insane explosion of spiteful hatred toward the original games, including a ton of coverage from publications who advocated for Capcom to continue actively upsetting the fans. A precursor to this strange discourse is the infamous 3 out of 10 God Hand review on IGN, written by a guy who clearly didn't even finish the game and honestly probably didn't even make it past the first stage. The review was just several paragraphs of the guy finding ways to avoid directly saying that the game was too Japanese, calling it a joke, comparing it to bad B-movies, and saying that it's too niche for its own good. And this review came out in a time where IGN was seen as one of the behemoths of online video game publications. It wouldn't be that much of a stretch to say that this review is probably a not insignificant contributor to the fact that we never got a sequel. There was also an open disgust for other games like Nier and Vanquish for also being off-puttingly Japanese. Not only that, but certain indie game devs gaining popularity at the time were also vocally disparaging of Japanese developers, including Phil Fish, who stated aloud in a conference that Japanese games suck to a Japanese developer's face, and he, all the other panelists, and the crowd began to laugh in unison. Phil said that Japanese developers' time has passed. Then he went on to subsequently rage quit the industry and cancel Fez 2 in a tweet. This was a very frustrating and obnoxious time where some Western devs were caught up in their own hype and getting high off their own farts to the point where they just brashly belittled their Eastern peers. Even in the Ninja Theory conference I mentioned earlier, where they talked about how their Dante was cooler than the original Dante, the points they made on why old Dante was bad was that he was just too Japanese, using pictures of J-rock bands and Japanese cosplayers to prove their point. It wasn't just thinly veiled xenophobia anymore, it was borderline fucking racist. There was a permeating aura during this time that if a game was too Japanese, then that was an inherently bad thing that made the medium worse, because there was an active campaign to make it seem more mature and artistic, and Japanese games and developers were hurting that movement by not reeling back their quirkiness. It was a very annoying, aggravating, insulting type of discourse that poisoned the community and industry, and while it hasn't completely disappeared yet, I'm glad that it's mostly gone. So, after reminiscing on all the horrible, awful, unbearable shit we had to endure during this era, maybe putting up with it was worth it in the end. It could be argued that most, if not all, of these trends were inevitable in a way, as unavoidable growing pains of an industry that was flourishing at an exponential rate, expanding in scope, resources, and popularity. Even through all the bad copycats and clones, predatory DLC practices, piss filters, and whatnot, we were still blessed with some incredible games in this period that are still looked fondly upon as niche classics, genre specials, or blockbuster all-timers, and considered the best of the generation, if not some of the best ever. Grand Theft Auto 4, Fallout New Vegas, Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, BioShock, Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Halo 3, Mass Effect, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1, 2, and Black Ops, Journey, Left 4 Dead 1 and 2, Dead Space 1 and 2, Metroid Prime 3, Metal Gear Solid 4, Bayonetta, Vanquish, Assassin's Creed 2, Portal, Red Dead Redemption, Civilization 5, The Last of Us, Mountain Blade, Yakuza 5, Deus Ex Human Revolution, Skate 1 through 3, Street Fighter 4, Burnout Paradise, Fable 2, Battlefield Bad Company 1 and 2, Saints Row 2, Rock Band, Batman Arkham, Metal Gear Rising, and more. For all the bullshit we had to put up with, we were also given some of our favorite games and franchises of all time. After all, this was the period where I discovered the Yakuza series and dove in by buying 3 on a total whim in an uneventful September back in 2011. Regardless of whether it was worth it or not, the past is the past, and all we can do now is look back on it, learn from it, and continue pressing forward, hoping that we take the best of what we've experienced with us. This concludes my video on the 7th generation, in all its glory and shame. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.